By the summer of 1944, the island of Saipan had become one of the most violently contested pieces of land in the Pacific War. To the United States, Saipan was not just another island. It was a launch pad. If captured, American B-29 bombers could reach the Japanese home islands for the first time. To Japan, losing Saipan meant the war had reached their doorstep. Both sides understood that what happened there would decide far more than the fate of a single island. On June 15, 1944, U.S. Marines stormed the beaches under brutal fire, clawing their way inland against entrenched Japanese defenders, who had spent months preparing for the invasion. The terrain was unforgiving: jagged coral, thick cane fields, volcanic ridges, and caves carved into the hillsides. Progress was measured in yards, not miles, and every night brought infiltration attacks, sudden counter-assaults, and desperate close-quarters fighting. By June 16th, the beachhead was secure, but the Japanese command had not yet committed its most dangerous reserve. That reserve was armor. The Imperial Japanese Army's 9th Tank Regiment, equipped primarily with Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, had been held back for a decisive counterblow. Though Japanese tanks were inferior to American Shermans in armor and firepower, they were still lethal in the chaos of night fighting. Japanese doctrine did not envision tanks fighting tank-on-tank battles. Instead, they were meant to smash through infantry lines, overrun artillery, and collapse defensive positions through shock and surprise. On Saipan, the plan was simple and desperate: a night assault combining tanks and infantry, driving straight into the Marine perimeter to break the invasion before it could fully stabilize. Among the Marines dug in that night was Private First Class Herbert Hodges. Hodges was not a famous officer, not a decorated veteran of multiple campaigns. He was an ordinary Marine rifleman, one of thousands who had landed on Saipan and survived the first days by discipline, instinct, and sheer stubbornness. Like many Marines, he carried the M1 Bazooka, not because he had trained extensively with it, but because every man who could handle one might need it when Japanese armor appeared. The bazooka was still a relatively new weapon, and confidence in it varied widely. Some Marines trusted it. Others joked about it, cursed its unreliability, or modified their gear in small, unofficial ways to make it work better under fire. Hodges was one of those men who tinkered. His bazooka setup was not officially sanctioned or pretty. Fellow Marines later described it as crude, improvised, almost laughable. Extra rockets were positioned where he could reach them quickly. His firing position was chosen less for regulation safety distance and more for survivability. It looked like something cobbled together in a junkyard rather than issued by the United States Marine Corps. Some men laughed. Others shook their heads. No one expected that weapon, or that Marine, to become the difference between holding the line and being overrun. Shortly after nightfall on June 16th, the jungle came alive. The first sounds were engines, low, grinding, unmistakable. Then came the clatter of tracks over coral and broken brush. Flares rose into the air, casting harsh white light over the Marine positions, and suddenly the darkness was filled with the silhouettes of Japanese tanks advancing in a loose formation. Infantry followed close behind them, using the tanks as moving shields. Machine guns opened fire. Tracers ripped across the lines. The attack was exactly what Marine commanders feared: a coordinated armored thrust aimed straight into thinly held positions before American heavy armor could fully respond. The first tank smashed into the perimeter, firing point-blank into foxholes and gun pits. Marine positions erupted in confusion, dust, smoke, and screams. Some men fired rifles uselessly at steel hulls. Others reached for grenades or scrambled to reposition anti-tank guns. In the chaos, Hodges did not retreat. He waited. The bazooka required nerve as much as aim. To penetrate a tank's armor, a Marine had to let it come dangerously close. Too far, and the rocket would fail to detonate properly. Too close, and the blast or machine gun fire could kill the operator instantly. Hodges held his ground as the first Type 97 rolled toward him, its turret sweeping left and right, infantry clustered around its flanks. When he fired, the rocket struck true. The shaped charge burned through the thin armor of the Japanese tank, igniting fuel and ammunition inside. The tank lurched, shuddered, and burst into flames. Its crew never escaped. Almost immediately, another tank moved forward to fill the gap, its commander likely unaware of what had just destroyed the lead vehicle. Hodges reloaded under fire. This was where his so-called junkyard setup mattered. He did not waste time fumbling for ammunition or repositioning unnecessarily. He fired again. Another tank was hit, disabled at close range, blocking the advance path and creating chaos among the following vehicles. Burning wrecks lit the battlefield, illuminating Marine positions and exposing Japanese infantry to rifle and machine gun fire. The assault did not stop. Tank after tank pressed forward, and Hodges kept firing. Each shot required him to remain exposed, to stand or kneel in positions that would have seemed suicidal to anyone watching from a distance. Japanese machine guns raked his area. Explosions threw dirt and shrapnel into the air. Still, he stayed in place, reloading and firing with relentless focus. Within minutes, the attack had turned into a killing ground. Japanese tanks attempted to maneuver around the burning hulks, only to present their thinner side armor to Hodges' bazooka. One after another, they were struck, immobilized, or destroyed outright. Some tanks burned. Others were left smoking, their crews abandoning them under fire. Marine riflemen began to realize what was happening and shifted their fire to support Hodges' position, cutting down infantry that tried to rush him. In roughly half an hour of sustained combat, Hodges destroyed 7 Japanese tanks. 7 armored vehicles, wiped out by a single Marine with a weapon others had doubted. The Japanese assault collapsed soon after. By dawn, the battlefield was littered with wreckage. Of the approximately 44 Japanese tanks committed to the attack, nearly all were destroyed by a combination of bazookas, 37mm guns, and American armor, but Hodges' stand had broken the momentum at a critical point, buying time and preventing a breakthrough that could have unraveled the entire sector. When the sun rose over Saipan, the Marines still held their lines. Hodges did not celebrate. He did not give speeches. He simply survived. Like many men who performed extraordinary acts under fire, he saw what he had done as necessary, not heroic. But that night, in the choking smoke and burning steel of Saipan, a Marine with a mocked-up bazooka proved that resolve, positioning, and raw courage could stop even a tank assault. And that was only the beginning of his story. By mid-June 1944, the American landings on Saipan had already torn open the defensive shell of the Japanese Empire's inner perimeter. Saipan was not just another island, it was a strategic linchpin. From its airfields, B-29 superfortresses could reach the Japanese home islands directly. Tokyo knew this. The Imperial Japanese Army knew it. and the soldiers of the 43rd Infantry Division and the 9th Tank Regiment stationed on Saipan understood that retreat was not an option. They were ordered to hold the island or die on it. As U.S. Marines pushed inland from the beaches, resistance hardened dramatically. The Japanese defense shifted from static coastal positions to aggressive counterattacks designed to break Marine momentum before airfields could be secured. Infantry infiltration increased at night. Snipers harassed supply lines, and armored elements, rarely used effectively by Japan in the Pacific, were being prepared for a decisive blow. Intelligence reports suggested that the Japanese were concentrating armor near the town of Garapan, but few Marines expected what would come next. On the night of June 16th, Japanese commanders committed nearly all remaining armor on Saipan in a desperate, coordinated assault. The 9th Tank Regiment rolled forward with Type 95 light tanks and Type 97 medium tanks, supported closely by infantry armed with satchel charges and bayonets. It was one of the largest tank attacks ever launched by Japan during the Pacific War. 44 tanks moved under cover of darkness, engines roaring, headlights occasionally flickering as they pushed toward Marine lines near the Islito airfield. The terrain favored chaos. Sugarcane fields, shallow ravines, shell craters, and wreckage from earlier fighting broke up visibility and distorted sound. The night was hot, humid, and thick with dust and smoke. For Marines dug into shallow foxholes, the ground itself seemed to vibrate as tanks approached. Many had never faced enemy armor before. Anti-tank guns were limited, Shermans were not always in position, and bazooka teams were scattered along the line with little time to coordinate. Private First Class Herbert Hodges was not supposed to be a tank killer. He was not assigned to an anti-armor unit, nor was he an engineer. He was an infantry marine armed with an M1 bazooka, an early model weapon that was notoriously unreliable, slow to reload, and dangerous to fire at close range. The weapon had a reputation for misfires, weak penetration against heavy armor, and a back blast that could kill anyone standing behind it. Many Marines distrusted it. Some outright mocked it. Hodges had modified his weapons slightly, not out of brilliance or engineering ambition, but out of necessity. He had reinforced parts, improved his handling routine, and practiced firing from awkward angles. Fellow Marines joked that he treated the bazooka like something cobbled together from scrap. In the daylight, it may have looked ridiculous. In the darkness of Saipan, it became lethal. When the Japanese tanks broke through the forward infantry screen, they did so with terrifying speed. Tracer fire streaked across the battlefield. Japanese infantry followed closely behind the armor, using the tanks as mobile shields. Marines fired desperately, but rifle rounds bounced harmlessly off steel hulls. One tank crushed a foxhole with its treads, killing the occupants instantly. Another fired point blank into a Marine position, blowing bodies and sandbags apart in a single blast. Hodges found himself near a shallow depression overlooking a narrow approach route. He could hear tanks before he could see them. The sound was unmistakable: grinding gears, revving engines, the metallic clatter of tracks biting into coral soil. When the first tank emerged from the smoke, it was less than 50 yards away and closing fast. There was no time to wait for orders. Hodges dropped prone, steadied his bazooka, and fired. The rocket slammed into the side armor of the tank, detonating with a sharp crack that echoed across the field. Flames burst from the engine compartment. The tank lurched forward, then stopped dead, its crew either killed or trapped inside as fire consumed the vehicle. The explosion illuminated Hodges' position. Japanese infantry immediately opened fire. Bullets snapped overhead. More rounds began falling nearby. Hodges reloaded under fire, hand shaking not from fear alone, but from the intense heat and noise surrounding him. The next tank was already advancing. He waited until it was closer, dangerously close. At nearly point-blank range, he fired again. The rocket struck low, punching through thin side armor. The tank erupted in smoke and sparks, its turret jerking violently as the crew tried and failed to escape. Within minutes, Hodges was no longer reacting, he was hunting. He shifted positions between shots, crawling through shell holes, firing from unexpected angles, striking tanks where armor was weakest. Japanese crews began to panic. Tanks bunched together, blocking each other's movement. Some attempted to reverse, only to be hit from the side or rear by Hodges or other Marines emboldened by his success. The fighting compressed into a brutal half-hour of chaos. Tanks burned. Ammunition cooked off inside wrecks, sending turret hatches flying. Infantry attacks collapsed as their armored cover vanished. Hodges fired again and again, each shot deliberate, each reload performed under constant threat of machine gun fire or a crushing tread. By the time the assault faltered, 7 Japanese tanks lay destroyed in his immediate sector. Others across the line were knocked out by Marines using grenades, anti-tank guns, and Sherman fire. Of the 44 tanks committed to the attack, nearly all were destroyed by dawn. It was the complete annihilation of Japanese armored forces on Saipan. When daylight came, the battlefield revealed the scale of what had happened. Burnout tanks littered the approach routes. Bodies lay scattered among twisted steel and churned earth. The Japanese offensive had failed utterly. The last meaningful armored counterattack on Saipan had been crushed. Hodges survived the night wounded, exhausted, and barely aware of what he had accomplished. There had been no cheering, no dramatic recognition in the moment. Only silence, broken by crackling fires and the distant sound of sporadic gunfire. For Hodges, it was simply another night of survival. What his actions had done, however, was far greater than any single engagement. By stopping the armored breakthrough, Hodges and the Marines around him ensured the protection of the airfield perimeter. Within days, American engineers would begin extending runways that would soon host the bombers capable of striking Japan itself. The failure of the tank assault sealed Saipan's fate. The Marines would continue to fight for weeks, but the psychological blow dealt to Japanese defenders that night was immense. Their armor was gone. Their last offensive gamble had failed, and it had been stopped, in part, by one Marine with a weapon many had laughed at until it mattered most. The night attack on June 16th bled seamlessly into the early hours of June 17th, and by now the battlefield around Hodges had transformed into something barely recognizable. Smoke hung low over the sugarcane fields and rocky ground, lit intermittently by burning vehicles and the flashes of gunfire. The Japanese assault had not broken the Marine line, but it had not ended either. More tanks were still coming, grinding forward in small groups, each accompanied by infantry who advanced in short rushes, using the armor as moving cover. For most Marines on the line, this was the moment when fear became physical. The sound of tank engines at night had a way of freezing men in place, especially when visibility dropped to almost nothing and orders became impossible to hear over the chaos. Hodges, however, was already moving again. He had expended much of his ready ammunition, and his assistant gunner was down, wounded during the earlier exchange. Alone now, Hodges crawled back toward a shallow depression where spare rockets had been dumped earlier in the night. He dragged the heavy rounds forward one at a time, feeling the heat from nearby fires scorch his face and arms. At one point, machine gun fire cut across the ground just inches above him, and he flattened himself into the dirt, waiting for the burst to pass before continuing. This was not heroism driven by adrenaline alone. It was calculation under pressure. Hodges understood that if the tanks broke through, the Marines behind him, many already wounded or disorganized, would be overrun. As another Type 97 tank emerged from the darkness, Hodges repositioned himself again, this time closer than before. He let the tank pass slightly, aiming not for the front armor, but the thinner side plating near the engine compartment. The bazooka back blast scorched the ground behind him, and the rocket struck true. Flames erupted instantly, and the tank lurched to a halt, its crew scrambling out into a storm of rifle and machine gun fire from Marine positions. The tank was knocked out, but Hodges did not stop to watch it burn. He was already scanning for the next target, aware that hesitation could be fatal. Japanese infantry now began actively hunting bazooka teams. The Japanese had learned, painfully and quickly, that American anti-tank weapons were their greatest threat. Small groups of soldiers moved forward low to the ground, throwing grenades and firing rifles toward suspected firing points. Hodges came under direct fire several times, bullets striking rocks and dirt inches from his head. At one point, a grenade landed nearby and exploded, showering him with debris and leaving his ears ringing. Shrapnel tore through his uniform, but none of it struck him directly. Dazed, half-blinded, he forced himself back into position. Another tank rolled forward, this one accompanied by infantry moving tightly alongside it. Hodges waited longer than before, letting both tank and soldiers advance closer. When he fired, the rocket struck the tank's side and detonated violently. The explosion killed or wounded several of the infantry sheltering beside it, breaking the coordination of the attack. The tank burned, blocking the path for the vehicles behind it. This moment was critical. Japanese armored doctrine relied heavily on momentum. Once that momentum was disrupted, confusion spread quickly. By now, word had spread among nearby Marines that someone was stopping the tanks. Hodges did not hear praise or cheers. There was no time for that. But he did notice rifle fire intensifying around him as other Marines realized the tanks could be killed and pressed their advantage. Bazooka teams elsewhere along the line began firing with renewed aggression. 37mm anti-tank guns, previously knocked out or abandoned, were manned again. The Japanese assault, once coordinated, began to fracture into isolated pockets of resistance. Hodges fired again, then again, knocking out 2 more tanks in rapid succession. Each shot was taken at close range, often under 50 yards. The danger was constant. If the bazooka failed, if a round misfired, or if a tank crew spotted him before he fired, there would be no second chance. The concussion from repeated launches bruised his shoulder and numbed his arms. Smoke burned his lungs, and sweat mixed with dirt until his face felt like it was caked in mud. Still, he kept moving, reloading, firing, and repositioning. By the time the sun began to hint at the horizon, Hodges had destroyed 7 tanks. Around him lay the wreckage of one of the most catastrophic armored losses the Imperial Japanese Army would suffer in the Pacific. Of the 44 tanks committed to the assault, nearly all were destroyed or abandoned. The ground was littered with twisted metal, burned-out hulls, and bodies. The Japanese attack had failed completely. For Hodges, the moment of realization did not come immediately. When the firing finally slowed, he slumped into the dirt, physically and mentally exhausted. His hands shook uncontrollably, and only then did he notice how close he had come to death multiple times over the past several hours. Officers moving along the line stopped when they reached his position, counting the destroyed tanks and trying to understand how one Marine had managed to hold a sector that should have collapsed. The Marine Corps would later credit Hodges with single-handedly knocking out 7 enemy tanks in approximately 30 minutes, an achievement almost without precedent in the Pacific War. But at the time, there was no ceremony, no speeches, no dramatic moment of recognition. There was only the silence that followed the storm, and the knowledge that a line had held when it should not have. What Hodges had done was not flashy or cinematic in the way war stories are often told. It was brutal, close-range, and terrifying work carried out by a young Marine who refused to give ground. His actions that night did not just stop tanks. They prevented a breakthrough that could have endangered an entire division during the critical early days of the Battle of Saipan. And as dawn broke over the battlefield, revealing the full scale of the destruction, it became clear that one man, with a simple weapon, had changed the course of a night that might otherwise have ended in disaster. By the early hours of June 17, 1944, the battlefield around Hodges' position had become something close to unreal. Smoke hung low over the shattered cane fields and coral ridges, illuminated intermittently by burning tanks and sporadic flares fired by Marines trying to orient themselves in the chaos. The Japanese night attack had begun with coordination and momentum, but it was now unraveling under the weight of its own losses. Where there had once been advancing armor and infantry formations, there were now isolated pockets of resistance, burning wrecks, and confused survivors trying to regroup in the darkness. Hodges remained at his firing position long after most men would have collapsed from exhaustion. His hands were blistered, his shoulders bruised from recoil and strain, and his ears rang continuously from repeated blasts at close range. The bazooka he carried was no longer clean or orderly. It was scorched, dirt-streaked, and hot to the touch. Each reload required precision and speed, because the Japanese infantry had not disappeared. They were still there, moving in the shadows, probing for weaknesses, throwing grenades, and firing sporadically in an effort to eliminate the Marine who had become the center of their collapsing assault. At one point during the fighting, Hodges' position was nearly overrun by a group of Japanese soldiers advancing behind the remaining tanks. Marine riflemen and machine gunners nearby helped beat them back, but the proximity of the fighting meant Hodges often fired with enemy soldiers only yards away. The soundscape of the battle was overwhelming. Shouted commands, tank engines grinding and stalling, small arms fire cracking in every direction, and the constant roar of explosions echoing through the darkness. What made Hodges stand even more remarkable was that he was not acting as part of a coordinated anti-tank team. Many of the Marines who had trained alongside him had been scattered, wounded, or killed in the opening moments of the assault. Communications were fragmentary at best. Orders, when they came, were shouted or relayed hand to hand. Hodges was operating largely on instinct, reacting to movement, sound, and the sudden appearance of armor looming out of the smoke. His success came not from a prepared defensive line, but from rapid decision-making under pressure, aggressive positioning, and a refusal to give ground. As the night wore on, Japanese resistance began to collapse entirely. The remaining tanks were either immobilized or abandoned, and Marine Sherman tanks and 37mm anti-tank guns were now able to operate more freely. By dawn, the scale of the Japanese failure became clear. Of the 44 tanks committed to the assault, nearly all had been destroyed. The battlefield was littered with twisted steel, shattered tracks, and burned-out hulls, many still smoldering as the sun rose over Saipan. Japanese infantry losses were severe, with entire units wiped out or scattered into the surrounding terrain. For Hodges, the moment when the firing finally stopped was not one of triumph, but exhaustion. He remained alert long after the immediate threat had passed, scanning the battlefield for signs of renewed movement. Only when officers and medics began moving through the lines did he finally allow himself to stand down. His uniform was torn and blackened, his face streaked with soot and sweat, and his body shaking from adrenaline and fatigue. He had been awake and fighting for hours under some of the most intense combat conditions imaginable. Word of what he had done spread quickly among the Marines who had survived the night. Officers conducting after-action reports struggled at first to believe the numbers. 7 tanks destroyed by a single Marine, using a standard infantry weapon, in the span of roughly half an hour during a coordinated armored assault. It sounded implausible even by the brutal standards of Pacific warfare. But recollections, eyewitness accounts, and the physical evidence left no doubt. Hodges had played a decisive role in breaking the Japanese attack at one of its most dangerous points. The impact of that night extended beyond the immediate tactical victory. The destruction of the Japanese 9th Tank Regiment at Saipan effectively ended Japan's ability to conduct large-scale armored operations in the Central Pacific. The loss of trained crews, vehicles, and logistical support could not be replaced. From that point forward, Japanese armor would be used sparingly, often in static defensive roles, and never again with the mass and coordination attempted on Saipan. For the Marines on the ground, the battle became a reference point, a story passed from unit to unit about what could happen when a single man refused to give way. Hodges did not seek attention, and he did not exaggerate his actions. In the days that followed, he returned to duty like countless other Marines who had survived another night in the Pacific. But his superiors took note. Reports moved up the chain of command, and his actions were formally documented as one of the most effective individual anti-tank engagements of the campaign. As Saipan continued to be fought over in the weeks that followed, with brutal fighting at places like Death Valley and Purple Heart Ridge, the memory of the night tank assault lingered. It served as both a warning and a reassurance. A warning of how violently the Japanese could still strike, even in apparent defeat. And a reassurance that, under the worst possible conditions, Marine infantrymen could adapt, improvise, and prevail against overwhelming odds. Hodges' stand did not end the battle for Saipan, but it helped ensure that the Japanese counterattack failed completely. The island would eventually fall, opening the door to direct air attacks on the Japanese home islands and altering the strategic balance of the war in the Pacific. And at the center of that turning point stood a young Marine with a bazooka, fighting alone in the darkness, refusing to let the line break. By dawn on Saipan, the battlefield around Herbert Hodges no longer resembled a coordinated attack. What had begun as a disciplined armored thrust by the Japanese 9th Tank Regiment had dissolved into a graveyard of twisted steel, burning hulls, and shattered infantry formations. The ground was scarred with craters, tracks, and discarded equipment. Japanese tanks lay immobilized at odd angles, some still smoldering, others torn open where bazooka rounds had punched through their thin armor. Of the 44 tanks committed to the assault, nearly all were destroyed by the time the sun rose. Among the Marines moving cautiously through the wreckage, few fully understood that one of the most decisive actions of the night had been carried out by a single private first class armed with a modified bazooka and relentless resolve. Herbert Hodges emerged from the chaos exhausted, partially deafened, and coated in dust and soot. His hands were blistered from repeated firing and reloading under extreme stress. The improvised adjustments he had made to his firing position, shifting angles, timing shots between bursts of machine gun fire, using shadows and wreckage for concealment, were not the actions of a reckless man, but of someone adapting instinctively to survive and fight. Each tank he destroyed had been a matter of seconds, measured decisions made under crushing pressure. The 7 tanks credited to Hodges were not eliminated in isolation. They were neutralized at moments when they threatened to punch through Marine lines, moments when hesitation would have meant collapse. As the battle line stabilized, officers began compiling after-action reports, tallying losses, and reconstructing the sequence of the night's events. Hodges' name surfaced repeatedly. Multiple witnesses confirmed seeing him engage tanks at dangerously close range, sometimes within 30 yards, firing and repositioning with almost mechanical focus. Senior officers initially questioned the numbers. 7 tanks in roughly half an hour sounded implausible, but the physical evidence was undeniable. Burnout Type 97 hulls lay in a staggered trail, each bearing the distinctive damage patterns consistent with bazooka hits. Hodges had not merely slowed the attack, he had shattered its momentum. Despite the magnitude of his actions, Hodges did not seek recognition. Like many Marines of his generation, he viewed what he had done as a grim necessity rather than an act of heroism. When questioned later, he reportedly downplayed his role, attributing the success of the defense to the collective effort of his unit. This attitude was common among frontline Marines, especially during the Pacific Campaign, where survival often depended less on individual glory and more on the unspoken understanding that every man had to hold his ground, no matter the odds. The Japanese assault on the night of June 16th to 17th marked the effective end of organized armored resistance on Saipan. The loss of the 9th Tank Regiment crippled Japanese counterattack capability and exposed the island's defenders to relentless American advances. Within weeks, Saipan would fall completely, providing the United States with airfields that placed Japan itself within bombing range. The strategic consequences of the battle were immense, but they were built upon countless individual moments like the one Hodges faced, moments where a single Marine's decision under fire shaped the outcome of an entire engagement. In the weeks that followed, Hodges returned to his duties with little fanfare. There were no dramatic speeches, no immediate headlines. His story circulated quietly within Marine circles, shared among men who understood the weight of such actions without needing embellishment. Over time, as the war moved on and new battles captured attention, his name faded from public memory. Unlike famous generals or celebrated aces, Hodges represented a different kind of wartime figure, the anonymous backbone of victory, whose contributions were decisive but rarely mythologized. Yet his stand on Saipan remains a powerful example of the realities of Pacific warfare. Japanese tanks, while formidable in earlier campaigns, were ill-suited to face determined infantry equipped with modern anti-armor weapons and willing to close to point-blank range. The M1 Bazooka, often dismissed early in the war as unreliable, proved devastating in the hands of Marines, who learned its strengths and limitations through brutal experience. Hodges' effectiveness was not just a product of bravery, but of adaptability, understanding where to aim, when to fire, and how to survive long enough to fire again. In retrospect, the night on Saipan underscores a central truth of World War II combat. Wars are not won solely by superior machines or grand strategies, but by individuals who endure fear and exhaustion and still act decisively. Herbert Hodges did not rewrite tactics manuals or alter the course of the war alone. But on that night, in that stretch of ground, his actions prevented a breakthrough that could have cost countless lives. His story stands as a reminder that history is often shaped by people whose names never make it into textbooks, yet whose courage under fire changes everything. When the guns finally fell silent on Saipan, Hodges was just one Marine among thousands preparing for the next battle. But for 30 minutes in the darkness, armed with a bazooka and nothing else, he became a one-man barrier against steel and fire, and held.